unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. Breaking the Mould, India's Untraveled Path to Prosperity is a big new book by the economists Raghuram, Rajan, and Rohit Lamba. The book is both a critique of India's development model as well as a manifesto for reform. Most notably, it challenges the conventional wisdom that India's primary goal should be to transform the country into a blue-collar manufacturing powerhouse. Rajan and Lamba argue that India cannot duplicate China's development model, but it has the unique opportunity to leapfrog by focusing higher up on the value chain. To discuss the book's ideas and its policy implications, I'm joined on the show today by Rohit Lamba. Rohit is an economist at the NYU-Abu Dhabi, who will soon be joining the economics department at Cornell University. He has twice worked in the Chief Economic Advisor's Office within the Indian Ministry of Finance. I am pleased to welcome him to the show for the very first time. Rohit, congrats on the book, and thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Milan. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here. I've known Milan for, I think, over a decade now, and it's just really, really heartening to see him flourish as this great scholar and more importantly, communicator of ideas. So it really makes me very happy and proud, Milan.
Well, thank you so much, Rohit. And I am equally happy and proud, having known you for a long time, to see where this book has gotten you, which is a lot of attention, I think, for some of the ideas that are in it. And we're going to get into that. Let me just start where you start. You begin the book with a question, which is, where is India going today, right? One of these kind of big meta questions. And you note that there are two dueling narratives that are currently doing the rounds, at least as far as the economy is concerned, right? So on the one hand, you have people who tout the fact that, look, India is the fifth largest economy in the world and the fastest growing major economy. But on the other hand, you have people who say India is actually really struggling. It's not growing fast enough to keep up with its young population, not growing fast enough to keep up with this enormous labor demand. And, you start out by saying, look, on the facts, the critics largely have it right. And so maybe we could start there. Tell us about kind of your macro assessment of where the Indian economy is circa 2024.
Right. So, like how we start in the early part of the book with Joan Robinson, that, that everything that is a truth about India's economy, the opposite could also be true, right? And it's basically that. So we do think that the hype about India, both domestic and global, to some extent is justified. So that's one side of the debate, that India is indeed the fastest growing economy in the G20. It does have, kind of this promising demographic dividend. It does seem to be in a position to attract some of the China plus one flows. That is the geopolitics of various firms and countries trying to diversify away from China. So there seems to be this sense that we are in the middle of a sweet spot. But, we've been there in some sense before. India has taken off or promised to take off many times. And I think if you frame the question as, can India grow rich before it becomes old? Can it actually take advantage of this demographic dividend before actually it fizzles out? There, we think actually that the critics or the side of arguments which put forward this fact that India is actually not growing fast enough to provide jobs for its teeming millions, to actually grow at every level is broadly correct. We offer some simple math to that end, in the sense that, there's a lot of debate about India's, where India's GDP is, what is its growth rate, and so on. But if we largely agree that the growth potential of India is around 6%, maybe a little higher than that, then today at $2,500 per capita GDP, at a 6% growth rate, India doubles its GDP every 12 years. So by 2047, which is what the Prime Minister has, laudably set a target for India to achieve, a middle income category, India goes to about $10,000, which is even lower than what China is at today. So we kind of open with this narrative that the critics are broadly correct in pointing out that India is simply not growing fast enough, both for its aspiration and its ambition, and to be able to provide jobs and a decent standard of living for hundreds of millions of its people.
So, Rohit, just to kind of press you on this for a second, you have a great paper with our mutual friend and mentor, Arvind Subramaniam, in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. We'll link to that. in which you have this table, which I always like citing because it's such an evocative table, where you show that the number of democracies that have been able to grow at least, I think, 4.5% for like a 30-year time horizon is vanishingly small, right? It's Botswana, India, a handful of other countries. So, stipulating to everything you've said, I think, what I think some of the boosters would say is, India has already outperformed many people's expectations. I mean, would you agree to that?
I think so. Yeah. So that's what I started off by saying. I think India, I at no point should this sort of push back against the the India hype story should lead the listener to conclude that India is not a success story. I think India is a huge success story, and I think India is a success story not just in an economic sense, and as you and your listeners would appreciate, in a political economy sense. This is what Arvind and I are trying to kind of push in that Journal of Economic Perspectives paper, that India is an outlier in a very interesting way, that it becomes democratic before it's developed, and it never gives up on it. And one should, and it's very hard to quantify this as an achievement. This is a massive achievement that all Indians and actually the world over people should be very proud of as an example, especially in today's world where, famously people are now saying that democracy is in a recession. So I think one should not take away from the fact that India has grown rapidly, steadily, and being democratic. Now, the main question, given this history, political economy history of India, is what next? Do we view these 30 years as an aberration and therefore a mistake, both in the political sense and the economic sense? Or do we kind of try to double down on both aspects of democracy and the unusual structural transformation of India, which we can talk about, and build on it?
So I want to get back to the politics, but let me just stick with the economics for a second. Over and over again, you make the point in the book that for late developers like India, the Chinese path to prosperity is no longer available to them, right? And maybe I could just kind of pause here and ask you, what is your and Raghu's interpretation of the quote unquote China model, and why exactly do you think that route is not an option for the India of today?
Right. So let's go back to, and we can link this from the show notes, this classic paper by Arthur Lewis, which is the two-sector model, on which a lot of the theory of what economists call structural transformation is based. It broadly argues that countries go from a surplus in agriculture to low-skill manufacturing and then eventually high-skill manufacturing and high-skill services. The US and UK grew in this way. They took over a century arguably to do that. But what is interesting about China and some other East Asian countries is that they were able to condense this first stage of structural transformation to a few decades. And one must not also ignore the fact that both Western Europe and the US, and in particular China and to some extent even Korea, did this under varying levels of autocracy and not really under kind of the democratic machinery that India has today. So why, what is remarkable obviously about this is that, the 20th century East Asian model was able to do this because of great labor arbitrage advantages. So as the West was moving low-scale manufacturing, it was looking for places that could do this at a very cheap price. And China, because of its very large area of land and very large labor force, was able to basically become the global manufacturing hub of the world, which is quite remarkable. Now, obviously, as we see with all these stuff on especially electric vehicles and so on, that China has actually gone up the value chain and doing very high skill manufacturing very well now. Now, the question is that for India is, can India do this today? And what we are arguing in the book is that that's very hard. We're not saying it's impossible. It's very hard for a variety of reasons. And we start by kind of questioning why wasn't India able to do this? And there are very quickly three broad reasons to what China was able to do. China had a very large and moderately educated labor force, which India didn't in the 20th century. It had a large one, but not a moderately skilled one, which arguably it still doesn't. China was highly decentralized. So what people mistake is that people think of China as a very centralized system of governance. It's a centralized system of polity, but it's not a centralized system of governance. It's actually a very decentralized system of governance, which we can go into more detail. India, for matters of historical importance, because of partition and because of the mistrust that elites had of local politicians, gave itself a very centralized system of governments. And third, obviously, that China was an autocracy, so it could suppress wages and it could also build infrastructure rapidly. Now, India, where it stands today, even though it does enjoy a unique opportunity in being able to, kind of push on, West's interest to diversify away from China, the route, that particular route is much harder. Because supply chains are much more firmly formed, and this, someone like Richard Baldwin talks about this constantly. And the main reason is that when China was competing, it was arguably competing with the American labor or even the Japanese labor. India today is not competing with the American labor or the Japanese labor. It is competing with the Chinese labor, the Vietnamese labor, the Bangladeshi labor. Second, manufacturing itself is changing rapidly because of automation, right? So, in the US, people are experiencing it. Even though the CHIPS Act is able to get certain kinds of industries back to the US, it is not being able to get the jobs back to the US, because the way US will manufacture cars, the way US will manufacture chips is going to be much more capital intensive than labor intensive. And third is India's own domestic constraints. Can India, given the democracy it is, given the various constraints that democracy and diversity put in India, actually do the kind of almost ruthless, reforms that China was able to do? So this is the broad framework under which we say that model is not really available to India.
Let me just kind of pick up on your last point, Rohit, because I think, let's just say listeners disagree with your premise about the kind of India going down this path. I suspect some of our listeners might. You argue in the book that it's even in that case not immediately clear that India would be firms' obvious choice for their emerging China plus one strategies, right? So even if you say, look, okay, India can try to replicate this model, what you're arguing in the book is that it's not clear it has the ingredients for success. Why not?
So, I'm an economic theorist by training, and in economic theory, we have this term called revealed preference. You can hypothesize as much as you want, but eventually let's look at what the firms are actually doing. Right. So last 2 years, and this could be, one shouldn't read too much into data for 2 to 3 years, but after pandemic, India's FDI as a fraction of GDP has gone down. Okay. Vietnam is getting much more China plus flows in absolute terms. Not, even though it is a much smaller country than India, the electronics industry in Vietnam is significantly bigger in absolute terms than it is in India. Right. Because of that's just about revealed preference. What are the reasons, right? The reasons are many, and it's complicated. One of the main reasons is that a lot of firms are actually in the US are going to Mexico because of what is called nearshoring, right? So people want to have supply chains concentrated near to where they are, and this is the leading reason. Second is, India still does have, and this was the kind of, for example, the reason that is given in the PLI document by the Ministry of Industry and Commerce, that India does have, a shortcoming in terms of infrastructure, but increasingly the big shortcoming is in terms of human capital. Like, does India actually have a large enough, moderately skilled labor force to be able to provide to all these firms that are coming to India? That by no means means that we don't think this is a strategy India should employ, but it's a strategy that is yet to see this kind of success that we are hoping it would.
Rohit, I want to kind of move now to kind of what your prescription is for the future. And you argue that, look, India has the opportunity to pivot, and I like this phrase, from brawn to brain, right? Sort of moving up the value chain, even at its very early stage of development. And the way that India could do this, you say, is to invest in services, either delivered directly or as embedded in manufactured goods as an alternative means of exports. And I wonder if you could unpack this for us, a little bit more in detail. So when you say for India to invest in services delivered directly or is embedded in manufacturing, what do those two pathways look like?
So, just briefly to go back to the famous Lewis article, what Lewis says is he doesn't actually talk about manufacturing and services per se. What he says is that, labor should actually move slowly to the more productive sector of the economy. That's basically his argument, right? And so in India, for various historical reasons, various political economy reasons, the most productive sector of the economy went from basically agriculture to high-skilled services. Now, obviously, that has its problems. But it is also true that we have developed a comparative advantage in both kinds of services. That is what you're mentioning. One is a direct service, which is basically, think of education, telemedicine, financial services, consulting services, IT services. And India is very clearly a global leader in these kinds of services for a variety of reasons, for access to reasonably high quality graduate engineers, English language, and so on. The second, which is a much more interesting and emerging class of services, is that the distinction between manufacturing and services per se is disappearing or blurring. Right. So think of the quintessential manufactured good, which is Henry Ford's car. Right. What we try to argue in the book is that the car itself is becoming more like a mobile phone. And if you see, for example, the company that is manufacturing cars in China now is the company that was earlier doing mobile phones. So a Tesla car, for example, has 40 to 50 million lines of code written into it. So what is manufacturing and what is services is also blurring. So one of the examples that we give in the book is, which a lot of listeners in India would have seen, is Lenskart, which is a very prominent now glasses store in India. But what is interesting is that Lenskart is not only selling glasses through its retail stores in many urban centers in India, it's also manufacturing them itself, right? So this is, again, lots of interesting examples of where services and manufacturers are kind of joined at the hip. And through a variety of examples in the book, what we're trying to argue is that India has a comparative advantage in this and already is actually producing very interesting new firms that are working at the intersection of manufacturing and services, and especially where services are embedded in manufacturing. And India should recognize its strength in this aspect.
I mean, just to kind of ask you to kind of extend on one thing, I think in reading some of the commentary about your book and some of the reviews and some of the tweets, people kind of say, look, Rajan and Lamba, they're saying that we need to do services instead of manufacturing. And the truth is we need to do all of the above. I don't read you guys as saying we don't need to do all of the above. Do you want to just clarify that?
I mean, we've tried to clarify it so many times. I think the thing is that when you're trying to, we think at least, when you're trying to give a slightly different argument to the existing dogma, people catch on to the difference, but not to the entirety of the argument. Right. So at no point, at least we would like to believe, at no point in time in the book, we're saying that India should give up manufacturing. Obviously, this would be a stupid idea. I think India has always been actually a pretty prominent global player in manufacturing. It's just that India is so large that it has never been a dominant part of India's economy, both in terms of employment or total output, like it was for Korea and then China. And what we're saying is that is not a coincidence. We have developed a comparative advantage due to various political economy forces, and we should try to be better at something we're already good at. At no point in time saying that we shouldn't try to pursue even low-skill manufacturing for that matter. In fact, we try to argue in the book how we've shot ourselves in the foot in various industries like textiles and apparel, which we should have been very good at and world leaders in by now. However, having said that, India is a relatively poor country where per capita GDP is $2,500, right? Our spending on health and education is still very limited for the large population that we have. So priorities need to be made, right? When you are putting aside $15 billion for fabrication of chips, right, you have to ask the question of opportunity cost of this money because we are a poor country.
So I want to get to the chips thing in just a second. But before I do that, let me just kind of a brief tangent. You talk in the book about GCCs, Global Capability Centers. And this is something that came up in a conversation we had a couple months ago with another one of our mutual friends, Pranjal Bandari, the economist from HSBC. Tell us a little bit about what GCCs are and why are they different from the classic kind of outsourcing models of the past where, big multinationals would locate their back-end infrastructure in India. Something different is going on. Tell us what.
So, I think people have this in mind, which is really a gross misconception. Actually, a lot of Indians also have this gross misconception that GCC is a call center or a BPO. Right? That may have been true in 1995. What is remarkable, again, and we talk about value added and value chain a lot in the book, is that this BPO of the yesteryears has actually rapidly moved up the value chain to become the prominent kind of office for a lot of big firms outside the US or outside their headquarters. So, for example, Google is building its largest office outside the US in Hyderabad. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Walmart, all these companies already have their largest offices outside the US in India. And what has happened in the last 10 years, and more rapidly so after COVID, is that these places are no longer just doing quote unquote back office work. They're actually doing they're actually making products, for example. So, for example, people in JP Morgan told us that their GCCs in India and Goldman Sachs also are making products that they're directly selling to customers all over the world. And the reason is very simple, actually, which is the labor arbitrage that we were talking about. For instance, with respect to manufacturing goods, where we don't think India has that big a comparative advantage. In fact, most industrialists we spoke to said to us that, yes, India does have cheaper labor than China in terms of low-scale manufacturing, but once you adjust it for skill, it's no longer true. On the other hand, when you look at high-skilled services, people who are working in these GCCs, if one of mine or Raghu's students in the United States actually wants to join any of these firms in New York or Chicago or San Francisco, they have to pay them at least $150,000 to $200,000 as a starting salary. In Bangalore, not 100%, but about 75% of this job is now being done by a kid from IIM Ahmedabad for $50,000. So you can just see the labor This is not a coincidence that these offices are just burgeoning in size in the last 5 to 10 years. And in fact, if you look at India's export figures, these actually feature prominently. Service exports from global capability centers have been riding rapidly, and various state governments in the south are actually trying to come up with sweetening deals to help them set up offices and so on. So what we think of global capability centers right now is really the tip of the iceberg in terms of what potential India has in offering other kinds of services in education, medicine, law, accounting, which hasn't really taken off in the way that financial consulting and IT services has.
So that was, I think, very useful corrective. Let me just come back to where you left off in the previous question, which is on semiconductors, right? One of the things you do in the book is discuss India's role in the semiconductor industry. And you ultimately raise the question about whether it makes sense for India to get into the chip-making race at all as a manufacturer, right? And you use the example of Micron's massive plans to build a semiconductor plant in Gujarat as a kind of cautionary tale. Tell us a little bit about why you're skeptical about the cost-benefit analysis here.
So I think it's a reasonable goal, actually a decent, good goal for India to have, to enter the supply chain of chips, as already a large economy and as an aspiring strong economy in the world, right? I think this is something almost everybody around the table can agree on. The problem is with the next step. So suppose you take this proposition to a bunch of seasoned economists and ask them, this is my goal, what should I do? Right. The first thing that, if you've even, all of us have become, experts in chips after reading Chris Miller, right? Like Chip Wars,
Chip
a fantastic,
Wars. Yeah,
it's a fantastic book, right? But even if you have a cursory knowledge of how the industry works and basic economic principles, the economist or even the historian on the table will ask you, okay, this is a decent goal. Well, the first principle you should understand is that supply chain in general are so complex, but in chips they're particularly so complex that you cannot own everything from source to sink. Okay, that's the first thing people will tell you. Okay, once you accept that fact, you will ask, so what is my comparative advantage? Where should I enter this supply chain then? Maybe with the long-term objective of trying to occupy large parts of the supply chain. But now what we say in the book, we give two reasons, right? One is that India actually already is designing 20 to 25% chips of the world only in Bangalore.
Right.
What is interesting, various estimates suggest that not only that, 40 to 50% of all chip designers of the world are either Indian or of Indian origin.
Right. So these are people in the diaspora who are living in the US or Singapore or wherever.
Exactly. And so what is really remarkable is that India seems to have at its disposal this amazing talent that has sort of grown in a very sort of niche expertise in chip design. It's not an easy task. So therefore, so now the problem is that this 20 to 25% of the people who are designing these chips, none of the intellectual property is held in India. And I think this is a point we try to repeatedly, repeat in the book, is that it is important to occupy intellectual property because that's how you capture rents. And because these designs are being done for Qualcomm and NVIDIA and other firms, India is not capturing the rents. So to us, it seems like a no-brainer that one should try to enter this market at the level of design. Now let's come to fabrication, right? Fabrication, unlike design, it's slightly less actually in value added, not even that much more in jobs, because these are very highly capital intensive firms that Micron and Tata are trying to set up. They're very capital intensive, right? Now the problem is that they're so capital intensive, and we don't have a head start in this part of the supply chain, that now actually, since we wrote the book, the amount that has been pledged by the Indian government is almost nearing $10 to $15 billion. This is staggering amount of money. Now,
in the book, I think you make the analogy about what this is as a share of the higher education budget.
So we were even talking about the Micron plant, for which $2 billion were being pledged by the state and the central government put together. Now, $2 billion is 1/3 of India's entire central government's higher education budget. So all the money that goes to your IITs, IIMs, IISc, Delhi University, Bombay, all central universities, it's 1/3 of that for one plant that is arguably going to generate 2 to 3, 4 to 5,000 jobs. So at this point, one must ask ourselves both, are we doing the right thing in terms of entering the supply chain at the right node? And B, what is the opportunity cost of this money?
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out.
So let me just kind of respond to that by telling you, I think, what the critics would say, which is, okay, look, I get the economics, all valid points, but this is a strategic sector, and India needs to invest in this capability for its own national security. How would you respond to that?
I would agree with that mostly, but the problem is that again, that's why I started with the statement that no country, even the US today, cannot aspire to own all of chip design and manufacturing from source to sink. So as long as you're dependent on ASML for the machinery and
TSMC
so then you cannot be completely self-sufficient. So what we try to argue in the book is that we would agree with the critics on the premise, but we won't agree with the mechanism that they're proposing. Actually, what you should do is you should try to gain a strong foothold in one part of the supply chain, probably where you have a comparative advantage, and then diversify where you're doing the other stuff from. This is an age-old technique. You cannot hope that you're going to do everything domestically. This harps of this 1970s, 80s license Raj, which didn't go down well. So we should be very careful with what the objective is and what is the mechanism that will help us achieve that objective.
So just on this, one of the trends we've seen in recent years, and you touch upon this in your book, and it's something that Shumitra Chatterjee, Arvind Subramani, many others have studied, which is this growing trend towards inwardness, right? So whether it's skepticism about regional trade pacts, rising import tariffs, we see many signs of a kind of renewed faith in import substitution. And what defenders of that approach say is, look, this model is sustainable today in a way that it wasn't before in the 1970s and 80s because of the massive size of India's domestic market. But in your book, you argue that actually the relative size of India's consumer market might be overblown. And I'm wondering if you could say more about that.
So, so two parts to this. One is, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with the people who would say that maybe this time is different, but it's not obvious yet. So the this time it is different argument would be not in terms of the consumer market so much, but in terms of state capacity. Some people would argue that, well, India's state capacity is higher to kind of renewed, to pursue industrial policy again. I have some sympathy with that argument, but the jury is out, right? Like, does India's bureaucratic efficiency mirror the Korean efficiency of the 80s or the Chinese efficiency of the 2000s? It's not obvious to me. But, one can be open to the argument that, yes, India can do certain things that it wasn't able to do in the 70s and 80s. Now, coming to the second part of your question, by the way, that still doesn't mean that the current way of doing industrial policy is the right one, because actually there is no openness to it. If you're pursuing industrial policy with only very large firms, can you say no to them after 5 years? right? And Danny Roderick and many others have talked about that it's not so much about picking winners, but actually about letting go of losers. Does Indian government have the capacity to tell Tata or Adani, okay, time's up?
It's a kind of classic problem that Devesh has written about on exit, right? How do you exit? Exit's always a problem for the Indian state.
How do you exit bad policies? Exactly. So, and the second part of it, and various people have tried to argue this in many ways, and I think this is where the hype around India and Indian market should worry us. Not because the hype is not essential to attract capital or even to raise the spirits of the citizens, but one should not buy into the hype beyond a point, because India's market is genuinely not as large as we think it is. And various people have written about it. One interesting place where we can refer to the listeners is Sajid Pai's Indus Valley report, where he tries to split the Indian market into India 1, India 2, and India 3. And even within India 1, he splits the market into India A1 and India 1. Right? And basically, he argues that most of these things that we are dreaming about, all these products, are for India 1 and 2, whereas India 3 is where about 900 million to a billion people lie. And the per capita GDP, he argues in his 2001 piece, and many people have said similar things, is around $1,000 per capita GDP, which is not much, right? So this argument that we somehow have a large market and therefore we can produce for the domestic market should be taken with a pinch of salt.
So, I want to ask you something, Rohit, that we've kind of touched on in various points, but I think it deserves some fleshing out, which is this question about the kind of politics and the democratic advantage, right? When we talk about moving up the value chain, our minds obviously go to human capital, right? And you argue in the book that democracy's great advantage in some sense is creating a governance framework for innovation. And yet India has been a democracy for 7.5 decades, but still has serious human capital limitations. I think it's very easy for people to look at the Indian model and the Indian case and say, oh, you've got to really invest more in human capital. I was hoping that you could just maybe unpack for us, as you think about this huge, this should be a podcast on its own, right? Just talking about this one element. What are some of the binding constraints in how India encourages, nurtures, promotes human capital? And what are some of the wins that you think it can get on the board to try to ease some of those constraints?
So this is where I think the fetishization with the China model is going horribly wrong, I think, is that it's picking up aspects of what it aspired to do in the realm of physical capital, but actually not taking it not so seriously India's early wins in its own human capital achievements, right? So whether you see continued, and it's just not at the feet of this government or that government, or actually it is at the feet of a lot of state governments, is the sheer disdain that a certain large class of polity has towards higher education in India, where we have actually let institutions deteriorate. And you've written about it, regarding, think tanks in Delhi, but also universities in general. The situation is deteriorating so rapidly that is actually very worrisome. And it's not about actually adding stuff. It's actually preventing deterioration of existing institutions. And this is very, very worrisome. Now, in some sense, even more worrisome is that even if India, let's suppose, wanted to pursue this model of let's say low-scale manufacturing, you need to have very large number of people who are moderately skilled. And that India is simply not being able to produce, no matter what, which way you cut the data, whether it's the Asar reports or it's whether the dropout rates after COVID amongst children in the Hindi heartland. And I think what is problematic about is that the problem is so diffused that solutions seem very evasive, right? And one of the things we discuss in the book that technology has done is shifted the goalpost in the political economy realm, or especially the political realm, of what to do about this in the following way: that even though technology has helped, and the Prime Minister and various chief ministers have used this very effectively to remove the middlemen from this relationship between the government and the citizens, what it has done is that it has encouraged a certain kind of spending, arguably at the cost of public service delivery. So it's much easier now to tell people that I provided you a gas cylinder rather than to tell people that I was able to improve your school or I was able to improve your health. Arguably one of the great victories of the Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi, because Delhi operates like a very small mayoralty almost, not in terms of people, but just in terms of how it controls, is that in Delhi you are able to do this. And this is one of the contributions of the Aam Aadmi Party, is to bring the conversation of health and education into the political realm, which hadn't really happened, because it's presiding over a very small governance region.
Now, do you think that you can envision a future in which politics becomes centered around a debate on public service provision? I'm struck by the debate we're now having on new welfareism, right? Where it seems like a trend that the BJP kind of picked up on, whether it's toilets, gas cylinders, bank accounts, electricity connections, pipe water. Now you see so many state governments, right? I mean, you just pick your state and you will find, doesn't matter, BJP, Congress, regional party, trying some version of this. But this all seems to elide the basic challenge of delivering quality public goods as opposed to private goods. And do you think that the ops foray into this area in Delhi, and we'll see whether that extends to Punjab as well, gives you some optimism that this can actually be the basis for political mobilization? Because that to me seems like when the switch gets turned on and, we start to see exciting things in the space.
So it's tough to answer that question because various observers and intellectuals do regard the big democratic failure of India is in this realm of unable to kind of provide public services of health and education in a systematic way and at scale. Right now, it can be both demand and supply driven, and it's to be seen which one, if at all, succeeds. What do I mean by that? What you're referring to is, in some sense, demand driven. Demand in the sense that can you get people to organize around asking for these goods and services? And that is difficult because you see, even especially in state elections, demand kind of gets concentrated around either the so-called freebies or around reservations in government jobs. To expand this demand and not let it be deflected is a tough ask. I'm not saying it cannot be done, but it requires a certain kind of mobilization of civil society. I don't think the politicians themselves will be able to move the debate completely from freebies to provision of public services. The other area where I have a slightly greater hope is in terms of factor markets, which is basically an economic jargon for saying that if the firms want this, if the economy demands it, then somehow there are going to be enough forces in the economics aspect of this that will force the hand of the polity and society to ask for. So even if you look at the mushrooming of engineering colleges in India, it was basically driven by factor markets. Now, the problem was that the quality couldn't keep up with the demand from the factor market. Right. But I'm hopeful that in either whether India takes the manufacturing route or services route, as firms start demanding, firms start training people, I have more hope there that somehow the demand will catch up.
So I want to just spend a second talking about foreign policy, because you do have a chapter on India's engagement with the world. And you talk about the things that India can do through bilateral relations and various regional multilateral fora to help essentially boost its domestic developmental agenda. And at one point you talk about its current priorities, and you have this line in there which I found really intriguing, in which you say, India's constant harping for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council reflects a lack of imagination in its foreign policy establishment. I'd be curious if you could just tell us a little bit why you say that, because that call for a permanent UNSC seat has become ubiquitous, right? It's almost in every foreign policy statement. It even shows up in bilateral statements, of course, between the U.S. and India. The U.S. is compelled to reaffirm its desire to want to see that. Tell us what you think is missing in this approach.
So it's just to clarify, right? It's not as if that we're saying that India doesn't deserve or India shouldn't aspire to have this seat, right? India absolutely, we think, deserves and aspire to have this permanent seat in the Security Council. It's how do you go about it, right? So, I'm reminded of that famous Deng phase that hide your talent and buy your time, right? So I think that there is a certain kind of shift we have seen in the last 10 years or so in thinking that by saying your aspirations out loud, you are actually somehow helping yourself. And again, truth lies somewhere in the middle, that obviously one should try to, communicate our idea about why we are okay with buying Russian oil at the peak of, a certain war and so on. And this is India's position because Russia has always been India's friend. And, enunciating that is very different than, scolding the West as to how we are right. And I think it is in that realm that we are making this statement that the biggest and the surest way to ensure that you actually have, a say at what you think you rightfully deserve is by being an economic powerhouse. There is just simply no two ways about it. And I think this is in that spirit that we're saying that instead of keeping on saying that we deserve this, we want this, we deserve this, we want this, one should singularly focus on what is our interest. And how should we grow bigger and stronger. There's this phrase that we have in the last chapter in Hindi, which we say, मेहनत इतनी खामोशी से करो कि सफलता शोर मचाए, which basically means that work assiduously in such silence that the success announces your arrival.
I mean, it's a little bit reminiscent of this line, which many people claim ownership of. I originally heard it, I think, out of the pen of Nitin Pai of Takshashila, this idea that the best foreign policy for India is 8% growth, right?
Yes.
If you're able to accomplish that over a sustained period, a lot of these other pieces start to fall into place.
Yeah, and it's getting a bit distracted, like if you listen to some of the, some commentators, there is this view coming in that, no, the goal is not just to become a strong economy, it's to become a strong civilizational state, for example. Now, I have some sympathy with this statement, right? I mean, I can understand where people are coming from. China used to make similar arguments, right? That it has a historical, kind of almost importance in the world, and India is no different, obviously. And many Indians feel that way, but, the point is that all this, for India already actually, unlike China, arguably, actually enjoys tremendous amount of soft power in the world. The power of its example, India has set even before it became rich. The only singular thing India has to do now is what Nitin Pai said, is to grow at 8% for 30 years continuously, and then everything else, we think will fall in place.
This is a bit of an aside, but I'm continuously amused by this idea that you see sometimes in some quarters in India and op-ed pages that there's this kind of anti-India bias around the world. I mean, I've spent most of my life in the United States where I just see tremendous interest and excitement over India, right? And I think a lot of this is shaped by their people's interactions with the diaspora. But whether it's in terms of art, music, culture, I mean, people actually want to see sort of India doing well. So getting back to the soft power, I actually think this is a really latent and quite potent force multiplier for India, right? In terms of trying to make moves that will increase its stature in the world. That you're kind of pushing on an open door is how I would view it. And, as somebody has also spent a lot of time abroad, I wonder if you'd feel the same.
I think that, if I could make a cheeky comment here, I think sometimes those in the corridors of power take New York Times opinion pages more seriously than New Yorkers and Americans do, And so I know where this sentiment is coming from. Yeah. I also have similar views sometimes of certain reportages on India, right? That they're unfair and so on. Having lived in abroad for more than a decade now. But as you're saying, just zoom out and you see the large amount of goodwill India enjoys. Not just in the US, but all over the world, but especially in the US, in the diaspora is one. The huge, which our mutual mentor Devesh Kapoor has written about, the huge success of the Indian diaspora in the US is testimony to it. So yes, there is obviously a distinction between state-to-state relationships and people-to-people relationships. There is a difference between state-to-state relationships and people-to-people relationships. But I don't think we should, lose sight of the big prize. And I think again, single-handedly pursuing economic growth has no substitute.
So I really liked, Rohit, the final chapter of your book, and maybe that's an apt place to end this conversation. In that chapter, you and Raghu kind of anticipate some of the criticisms of your arguments, and you address them head on. And one of those criticisms, and I think it's one that we've all heard, is, if only India could be more like China. And I think what people mean by that is if it could be strong, it could be better in providing strong kind of top-down centralized governance, even if that means curtailing civil liberties, basic freedoms. You both are very skeptical of that line of inquiry, and you point out something which I think is not very well understood in India, and I'd just love for you to reflect on it for a few moments, which is that it is precisely under coalition governments, when you've had multi-party stakeholders, that India's economy has enjoyed the fastest growth rates, right? It has not been when we've had a very strong single-party majority that's tried to govern top-down. And I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about why you think that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, just again, this is not about taking sides or anything. It's just about, if you look at the data, the last time a government had absolute majority in India was the Rajiv Gandhi government, and now for the last 8-10 years it's Prime Minister Modi's government. And a large part of not just growth, but I would argue growth setting reforms have happened between 1991 and 2004 and 5. And these were under the Narasimha Rao government was a minority government, and was able to do a lot. And after that, we had a sequence of 1 or 2 year governments. And then we had, obviously, the Vajpayee government, which was also, basically a coalition government. And they continued spectacularly with economic reforms. So I think it's not to say that, and then one can try to rationalize this, right? At no point in time are we meaning that, having governments with majority is a bad thing. We just try to reflect, what is it that works and what is it that doesn't work? And it is clear that that to do deep reforms in India, reforms that are, fairly sweeping, you require, because India is not China, India is not the US, India is its own thing, you require a certain level of consensus building. And one can actually learn this from, let's say, examples from the last 10 years, right? So some of the spectacular success stories of the current government have been, let's say, the infrastructure build-up, the digital stack, and, initially glitchy, but eventually successful implementation of the GST. There can be many other things we can credit to the government, but these arguably are the three most important reforms that happened over the last things that have happened over the last 10 years. You will notice that in each of these 10 things, each of these three things, there was a consensus that is more than 2 decades old, right? Right from the Golden Quadrilateral that Vajpayee ji started and so on, the digital stack Nandan did with the last government and was spectacularly kind of moved forward by this government. The GST was being debated forever, right? Now let's look at 3 other policies: demonetization, the lockdown, and eventually what happened with the second wave during COVID, and the farm laws. Arguably, I would say this is the exact opposite of the first 3 success stories that I gave, which happened with very little consensus through a jhatka kind of approach, and not even the government's most arduous supporters would say these were successes. Right. So India is different, right? And I think there is this misconception that people have that even in China, for example, things are just imposed. There's actually a lot of experimentation that goes on. There's a lot of trial and error that goes on before certain policies are adopted at a national scale. Even in India, the Narega was for the first time started in Maharashtra. The midday meal scheme was started in Tamil Nadu, and so on. The RTI was also done at a state level in Maharashtra first. So, lots of these success stories have very small beginnings. Because India is a complicated country, it's very hard to know what would work on a very large scale. And I think for this reason, one must appreciate. At no point in time am I suggesting that India should therefore always have coalition governments, but one must appreciate the power of persuasion in actually executing reform, not intellectualizing, but executing reforms that have long legs.
Yeah, I mean, another way to kind of reframe what you just said, Rohit, is coalition governments are good because it makes it harder to do bad things, but also harder to undo the good things, right?
Yes. And there was a consensus that was built up, which, because it had many fathers, the consensus kept going about liberalizing, about, which started with Narasimha Rao. And I think once you make the buck stop with only one office or one person or even one coterie of people, it's both easy to reverse that and in fact even harder for everybody to make everybody accept the reform. So this is very important.
My guest on the show this week is Rohit Lamba. He's an economist at NYU-Abu Dhabi and the co-author with Raghuram Rajan of the new book, Breaking the Mould, India's Untraveled Path to Prosperity. It's just been published in the United States by Princeton University Press, getting a ton of attention in India and now I think set to get a ton of attention outside of India. Rohit, congrats on all of your success with the book, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thanks, Brent. It was a real pleasure.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.